Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I'm the marketing manager over here at Strucksoft. Just for those of you who are new with us today, our principal software, MWF, which stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, our senior technician, Christina, will focus on shop drawings and how to create different views, bill of materials, dimension styles, and labeling. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. At the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. In order to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel. Just please also make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, thanks Tanya. Hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. So for today, I thought we would kind of strictly focus on shop drawings. I know I had touched on a few of the options in previous webinars and kind of bounced around a few of those options. But I think since it's a pretty in-depth topic and something that I'm sure a lot of you guys use on a daily basis, probably is worth having its own webinar. So because of that, I'm just going to go over some of the basics. So starting to create your different views, creating your dimension styles, some of the different labeling options that we have, and then finally maybe talking a little bit more about Revit schedules, some of the bill of material options, and we'll just kind of work our way generally through the drawings. All right. So for today's project, it's pretty simple, just kind of a garage that I've got laid out. And I've also got some sheathing on my exterior walls here. And then just to keep it simple, my garage doors themselves are just single layer, regular MWF panels. So these guys here are not multi-layer panels, just to give us some variation. And obviously I'm doing it in lumber today, but everything that I'm doing today applies to light gauge as well. So when you're first getting started with your shop drawings, you're going to go to your wall drawing options, go to the very first one, your manager, and this is going to list all of your shop drawing settings and all of the different options that you have. So there is an 11:17 default that comes out of the box. It should already have a few different views set up in your sheets. So this is one that I'll kind of use and customize to make it my own. And I've just duplicated it and created one for today's webinar. So I still have a list of the same view options, just missing probably two of the most crucial views that we're going to make today. I'm just missing the elevation view, and I'm also missing the bill of material. So we're going to cover how to make those. But before we even jump there, as a step one, if you're starting shop drawings from scratch, I'm just going to point out this sheet directory button over here. We'll just close the active windows in the background. But your sheet directory button, it's basically just going to bring you directly to the installation folder. And these will show all of the default title blocks that we have for the software. So obviously you're going to want to duplicate these, bring in your own company logos. So you can always take these default ones that we have and bring in your own title blocks. So the title block sheet itself, it's a Revit project, and it uses these zones. So for anyone who's not familiar with these zones, these are what you're going to use to actually orient your different view options to your sheet. So obviously I've got it set up for my elevation, my top and bottom views, and I've got a few extra zones off to the side that I can fill in for my bill of materials, maybe some other optional views that I want to add in. But these guys are pretty simple. If you do want to add in some extra zones, you can always change the width and height of these zones, but you can copy paste them, move them around, and just delete them with Revit. And the naming as well, you can obviously name your zones whatever you like, but just so you're able to orient yourself a little bit easier when we go orient the views, I'll always just name them with the actual view that it's going to take. So pretty simple, just have my views set up. And again, for the actual title block here, this is just a family. So if you do want to make larger sheets, obviously bring in your own logos, or if you've already got your title block family, you can load that in and then just load it into your title block project. So this is obviously probably the first step if you don't have your sheet set up. Just make sure you've got your title block, all of your zones in the right spot, and then you're good to go. So when you actually do go ahead and have your sheet, you can then go ahead and just create a new one. We'll give the sheet a name, of course. And then if you go ahead and edit that sheet, this is where you can start orienting and picking your views. So I'm going to pick my 11 by 17. And then it's going to load in all those same zones. And this is where the naming that I mentioned is going to come in handy. So you'll know where you want to orient everything. So for my top view, I can maybe put my reflected ceiling plan. If I want my bottom view, I can put my floor plan. So once you start creating your views, you'll then be able to orient them on the sheet like this. So besides kind of your view orientation, there are some other simple options in here. You can put margins if you didn't account for those while creating your title block. And then there's just the general sheet name and sheet numbering method if you have those parameters on your sheet. It's just going to choose how you want to name your sheet. So you can put in a fixed name or just use whatever your panel ID is. And then same thing if you did want to add a sheet number, you can choose the actual panel number itself. If you're running positioning, you can choose the position ID. So just different options to label out your sheets. I'll just point this out that might be particularly useful. You could, of course, create multiple sheets for one panel if need be. So if you do have a pretty big wall, you just want the elevation on its own sheet, as an example. You can always just add a page number. So it'll give you a number in brackets, 1, 2, if there are multiple sheets associated to one panel. So this is just preliminary settings, getting your sheet set up and getting associated and linking it to your shop drawing settings. All right. And then I did cover this a while back in another webinar, but both shop drawings options now for multi-layer and for standard are both combined in one cohesive shop drawing engine now. So if you also want to make a sheet for your standard panels, like I have here for my garage doors, I can go ahead and reuse my same views and basically just create one set of options for both types of panels. So for that, we just have the sheet layout properties separated into these two tabs. All right. So typically, you're probably going to want to add your views. You can always use the ones that do come default out of the box. But if you do want to create your own or start from scratch, we're going to go ahead, hit the little plus, and add all of our views. So the first tab that we have are for schedules. The second tab is for sub-assemblies. And then the last tab is for your general, excuse me, your general views. So that's just how we've categorized, obviously, the different view options. If you are using sub-assemblies, you just want specific elevation views and side views for your sub-assemblies, then they're categorized into their own tab over here. I'm going to go to my general view tab, and I just want to again add in an elevation. So we're going to click that. So first thing, we'll of course give it a name. And then it's just going to be kind of filtering through this list and choosing which dimension styles you want in your elevation view. So you've got your basics. You can choose an overall diagonal as well to make sure that your panel's square. You've got some specific ones for openings. So it's pretty simple with the pictures. It'll kind of dictate what each of these dimensions can do. So maybe let's go with the structural members. You can do an overall diagonal and maybe my right elevation height. So there are some pretty simple ones for the framing. But I'll also point out that if we scroll a little bit further down, you'll see some other ones for sheathing as well. So if you are adding sheathing to your walls, like we have here, these elevation views, you'll see in a bit that we can choose which layers we want to see in this view. So you can reuse the same elevation view for framing, sheathing. There's also some extra options in here if you want to see electrical fixtures and have those dimensioned. MEP as well. So if you do want multiple different elements in one elevation view, then you can always list this and get the dimensions this way as well. So since I do have some sheathing, let's also go ahead and maybe choose it on the left side. So we'll just get the sheathing heights. So this is, again, general dimensioning. And then it's also going to be an option to choose your labeling. So for the labels, you'll see here there are a few specific ones. If you want to label your openings, you can even put a center of gravity for just single layer panels. If you want to label MEP and quantify those. So a few different options to label. But for your actual members, I'm going to stick with the first option to label by method. And this will let you choose specific labeling options that we have, so different parameters, and it'll break down and you're able to select which specific parameter you want to use to label your members. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this option here. So from here, we've got the general viewport option, and this is where it starts to get pretty simple. So we've got our sheet view and the insertion points, and these are where you're going to be able to orient your view to your zone. So that's why there's two different view options. Typically for an elevation view, I'll make sure that my dead center or my mid-center elevation is aligned to the mid-center of my zone. I'm not going to want any titles on these. And the next few options are for visual styles. So the details, if you do want to see maybe plumbing or anything else that might be in that wall, you can go ahead and kind of go through these options individually and select what you want. Personally, I always like creating a Revit view template if it's something I'm going to use again and again. I've got one set up for my elevation view. So I'm just going to associate that with this view here, and that'll negate all these options down here. So we've got our view template already selected. And last thing in this viewport, and this is where we get into kind of a little bit of a difference between multi-layer and single layer panels, is the layer selection. So like I mentioned, you can have one elevation view if you want sheathing and your framing in one view. Or you can have different elevation views for each different layer. This is going to be completely up to you and how much space you have on your sheet. But personally, what I do prefer is selecting both layers, and then I'll just add some transparency to my sheathing, so I'll even be able to see where that sheathing laps up on my stud. So two different options for layer selection. You can go by index. So assuming your structural layer is at your core center line, so in between those core boundaries, your structural layer will be the 0. And then you can go up to 6 layers on either side. So you can specify that way what you want to see. Or if you do know that you obviously want your structure in there and the substrate, then you could also just select it by the function. And I'll just kind of highlight this little note. But since you do just have one set of view options now for single layer and for multi-layer, you can reuse this elevation. If the sheathing exists, it'll place it. If not, then it's just going to place your single standard layer. So you don't have to create two separate views with different checkboxes. If it exists in the panel, it'll automatically pop up on the sheet. So this is pretty much everything I wanted to cover in this viewport option here. I'll make a quick note of dimensions, but this is pretty simple. Based on the dimensions that you selected from that initial list, you can start selecting the different styles. You can specify the offset from your actual panel. And then some of those extra dimensions will just have a few extra specific options. So for my stud dimension style here, it's just obviously going to ask you where you want your dimension to hit. If it's going to be at the center of the stud, on the right side, on the left side. And the other thing I'll highlight as well for most of these options is that you do have the option to either pick a continuous or ordinate dimension type. And in the case for dimensioning out your studs, you do have the option to actually specify both. So if you did want both line type styles, you can always enable that and it'll replace one dimension string with 2 dimension lines of both types. So this is pretty simple, just to set up your dimensions. And now we're going to move on to the labels. So this is something I did want to highlight. So for those of you who are labeling and maybe want to quantify all of the identical members together, then I always recommend using the schedule label. So this guy here for the schedule label, and I'm just going to bounce around a little bit, but the schedule label will actually refer to a text file in your installation folder. So you can go through here, go to the config, and open up the tag mapping text. And if you're using the schedule label, you can actually control which preview you want to use to label out your studs. So if you want your infill studs to have a different prefix, you can always change these out, and everything that's identical will obviously get that prefix and then a number. So horizontals, you could always change top and bottom tracks. So if you did have a specific naming, depending on the member types, you can change the prefix here, and then it'll use that prefix and then just assign the numbering. So I did just want to highlight that. Not sure if it's something that's commonly known, but if you do want to quantify everything, group everything together, you can use the schedule label. You're able to change the prefix, and this is always something that you can obviously pull into a Revit schedule. So this is the schedule label option, but I'll highlight the other ones as well. The by name option will just use the regular labeling, so S1, S2, S3, basically the unique ID that's given to every single member. And then there are some other options in here if you want to use positioning. If you're running CNC on some of your panels, there's usually an advanced positioning ID that'll get stamped onto the stud once it's rolled. So that's something that you can pull in to your elevation view as well. So I typically like to use the schedule label, and that'll quantify everything. And then again, the rest of the label properties are pretty simple. It's just setting up the alignment, your text styles. You can specify specific members if you want to label by selection. And then the next thing as well is the proximity grouping. So if you are running things by schedule label and they're going to be identical, if you have a double stud, for example, you can group that under one label and it'll just give you the count in brackets. So this is just if you don't want to group. if you do want to add that grouping number, or if you just want to put the labels along the sides so they don't overlap. And then these here are just some general options for the labeling. So besides the labels, this pretty much covered everything in this elevation view. The only thing I'm going to highlight is just this top view orientation option that I skipped before. But this is pretty simple. It's just going to select which side of the panel you want to see. So if you are running your panel direction left to right from the interior side of the wall, you could always select the panel direction option, and you know you're going to get the interior side every single time. But you can always specify it. This will just show the exterior side of the panel, regardless of direction. And this one here will show the interior side. So typically for sheathing, I like to overlay that on top of my studs. So I might just have it specify to show the exterior side only, regardless of what direction my panel is. So that is going to bring up everything for the framing elevation. No, it's a little overwhelming, but trust me, it is pretty simple once you start to know where everything lives. The next option now I'm just going to show as well is how to create the schedule. So now that we're starting to create schedules, this will also pull in revit schedules a little bit as well. So let's go ahead and add our new schedule. And there are quite a few scheduling options to choose from. But the main one will be this custom schedule option over here. So this will automatically produce a revit schedule. And there are some down here, but these are going to be specific for maybe hold downs, hardware. You can have a schedule for MEP if you want to see how many pipes are running through your panel. And there is a custom bill of material option, but this will just give you a plain text title block just of your members that are quantified. It's not going to give you a revit schedule. So the typical option I always use here is this custom schedule option. Same thing, we'll give it a name. And you'll see a lot of the same options again. So let's maybe assign this bottom left to bottom left. I'm going to want to stick it in my bottom left corner of my title block so I can associate it directly in the corner. And again, it's going to depend on what you want to see in your schedule. I like making one separate schedule for my sheathing and one separate for my studs. It'll be a little bit easier to control the parameters that way. So this will just be my cut list, and I'm only going to use my structural layer. So then you get into some of the layout options. So for the layout, pretty simple again. It's just going to be your text types. If you want every item, if you want every stud itemized. And I'm not going to show a title in this case. And let's also not itemize every instance. I'm going to want to use my schedule label and group things together. So then this brings you to the Data tab. So for this, if you're already pretty comfortable with Revit schedules, then you can create a master and just duplicate this one. We'll reapply our own filters to filter it out for just the one specific panel you're running the sheet on. But if you don't have a master schedule set up yet, then what you can always do is actually add in the fields directly in here. And then you can always use this schedule that's going to pop up for just the one panel, kind of reverse engineer it and make your master schedule from this. So if I just put in my schedule label, let's also put in the length parameter. So we'll put in reported length. Let's get the family type. And let's also add in the count. Maybe I'll move the type up. There we go. So this is a good approach to use. Like I mentioned, if you don't have a master schedule, or even if you're not the most comfortable with Revit schedules yet, it kind of mimics how Revit schedules works, but without having to click through and kind of figure out which fields you're going to use. For anyone who started learning Revit schedules, you have my sympathies. It's a little complicated at the beginning, but this is maybe a good approach to take on if you're just starting to learn it. It's a little bit simple. So you can always change out the header option directly in here. Obviously, we're not going to maybe want to use the full parameter name, so we can always change this. And then you've got your basic alignment options. You can auto calculate the width of the column. And then you could always choose the sorting option in here. And this is what will group all of the identical members together. Let's maybe just change this to length. Okay, so we've got our basic schedule set up, got our parameters, and then I can just go ahead and say okay. And I've got my view option. So only thing left to do really is to start associating your views. So I was going to do my bottom left zone with my cut list. And then let's also add in the reflected view and the floor plan view. And I've got a 3D view set up here as well. So I'm going to run this on just my basic single layer panel. Everything's set up properly. can grab, obviously, multiple panels at once, grab your settings, and then just let it run. So I didn't go through and select the dimension styles that maybe would have been a little bit better. So we'll see how it looks for a first draft. There we go, not so bad. There we go. So for this particular panel here, got our top and bottom views. Everything's dimensioned. I could maybe forego the style and use one that's a little cleaner, but you could always go back and set that up in your shop drawing settings. Everything's labeled, grouped together. So this is where that proximity grouping comes in. Can add the extra number in the brackets instead of having individual labels. Just make it look a lot cleaner. And then you've got your general Revit schedule here as well. So for anyone, like I mentioned, who's starting off from scratch with Revit schedules, you can always create it here in the shop drawing settings. And then what I typically like to do is duplicate this guy. Maybe let's rename it. There we go. I'm just going to call it my master cut list. And then you can go ahead and remove some of these filters that we auto apply. And this will make it a general Revit schedule that you can then use to duplicate. Just saves you the hassle of having to add in the fields, get your sorting figured out. So this is something that you could always reuse. Over here. And we can always go ahead and duplicate this guy for every single shop drawing. All right, so that's it for me today. As Tanya mentioned, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. Just to remind everyone, if you would like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just also please make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has closed. As always, please feel free to share this recording with any colleagues. I'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, Christina, one just came through from Tim. Is there a check to ensure the views in the zones on the sheets do not overlap?
So there's no check. It will depend on, of course, how your zones are set up. It's just going to take some practice with orienting it with the options in here. So if you do notice it's overlapping a bit, you can always come in here and modify the insertion point, or you can always go ahead and shorten your zone width as well. If you have it to the outer corners, that will shift it slightly. So it is a little bit of just kind of playing around with the scale and with the zones.
Okay, perfect. We just have another question from Michael. Can you go over the basics of panel labels?
Sure. So I'll actually show the parameters off to the side here, and I think that'll be a little bit easier to kind of understand the labeling. But for the option that I selected, the schedule label, this is something that's going to be applied, and you could always change that prefix. Let's go to my elevation view. So that's where the schedule label comes in. If you did want to run it by name, then that will just use the plain BMSF label here. So that S1, 2, 3 option that we give to every element, so it has its own unique ID. So if you did want to itemize everything in your schedule, you could always use this labeling. And there is an option over here for distribution. It's essentially pretty similar to the schedule label. It's controlled through here. It assigns the same label, but what I do like about using the schedule label versus the distribution label is that you can always change your prefix based on that tag mapping text file that I showed earlier. So I know it's a little confusing, but this guy will basically just give it an arbitrary ID that you can't really control, whereas the schedule label, you can go in with that tag mapping and change it if you need to. So the distribution label and the schedule label are kind of interchangeable if you're fine with the defaults that we assign. And the last two labeling options, I did cover positioning a while back in a webinar, but you can basically assign another parameter. This is an ID that can be pulled into a member Excel list that we have here. So when we did a webinar a while back on outputs, I did cover that option over here. So you could always use that ID. And then the advanced positioning one is kind of more strictly for CNC. For those of you who are rule forming, it automatically assigns an advanced ID when you run the CNC. So this is another label that you could always pull. So it'll match what you get when you roll your studs.
Christina, Michael actually had a follow-up. He was actually referring to generating the panel label under miscellaneous settings.
I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I understand what he means by the miscellaneous settings. But if he wants, I can respond to him by email. We can always clarify it by that.
Okay, perfect. We just have time for one more question. This one's from Tim. How are the panel sheets impacted by the stacking bundling of the panels? If stacking occurs after the panel sheet has been created, does a panel stack retroactively get updated on the panel sheet?
So if he means, I'm not sure if I know what he means by stacking, if he's referring to panel stacker. But basically when you are making any kind of change to your panels, regardless if it's members or sheathing, or if something does change, we say as a general workflow to make sure to do the drawings last. So if anything does change, you do have a refresh option over here. So this will refresh the drawings. You can refresh your schedule. But the only thing is that if something does change, maybe the dimension style, or it does take an extra dimension, then you will just have to regenerate the drawings. So it's a little bit of kind of a back and forth. If it's a basic update that you just want to maybe change visually, then you can always go ahead and refresh it. But if it's a pretty large change, then I do just suggest that you regenerate your shop drawing. So again, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but if anything, we could always clear it up, excuse me, via email.
Awesome. All right, that looks like it's a wrap for today. For any questions that have not been answered during the session, we'll make sure to get to them today, as well as if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, you'll have our contact details in the email sent later today. Once again, I just want to say thank you to Christina and thank you to everyone who attended the webinar. Just want to mention quickly to stay tuned. We'll be having a webinar next week as well. Information on that will be coming in the mailer as well. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. Thank you.